Well, I guess my wife is still upstairs, so I have to introduce her when she's back down. Um, she and I started the Ride for Autism um, in 2010 in September. So this one coming up will be our fourth annual. At the first ride, I had a couple come to me and tell me that they had an autistic son a little bit younger than I am. And after talking to me for a bit, they asked me how I stopped being angry at the world. I didn't have a good answer for them at the time for reasons I think will become clear as I continue talking. But I've heard that question several more times. I have a friend in Southern California who has been trying to help her brother who recently turned 30. And she asked me how could she help him not be so angry at the world. And this question has come to me in so many different ways, and I've only recently come up with some good ways to answer it. So I'm going to tell you some of my stories, and I'm hoping along the way I can answer this question. I think before we can start to answer the question, we have to know where the anger comes from. A really wise autistic friend of mine, whose name I always somehow forget every time I say this, said once, the problem with forcing a square peg into a round hole isn't that it takes so much pounding, it's that you are destroying the peg. Now, anger comes from a combination of pain and frustration, especially when it's that deep, and it comes from a lot of pain and frustration over a period of time. I think the pain from being forced into a hole where you don't fit is quite sufficient to explain the anger at the world that so many have recognized in adults on the spectrum. So I was diagnosed by Dr. Tyler Whitney. I don't know how many of you know him. He has since moved to Atlanta to work with the CDC. I started seeing him in November of 2009 and was diagnosed in January of 2010. The couple years leading up to me going to see Dr. Whitney were particularly difficult for me, and certainly for my wife. By the time I actually got to see Dr. Whitney, we had been married for 6 years. As I tell you some of these stories, you can imagine being in her place, not knowing exactly what it is that you're dealing with. She decided that a lot of my initial struggles were related to my physical disability. My left arm is paralyzed from an accident in 1997. So in the time leading up to going to see Dr. Whitney, I was getting more and more depressed. I told Chris several times, I don't even know who I am anymore. And I got to where I just didn't enjoy doing anything. I just wanted to get what I had to get done out of the way and then do something quiet on my own or just hide. I changed jobs right in the middle of that. And after the job change, I ended up spending an awful lot of time with a very difficult coworker. I think a big part of the struggle of being autistic isn't the struggles that you have. Everybody runs into a difficult coworker at times. It's what happens when you start asking for help. I think this should be readily obvious, but just in case people don't think it through, people with impairments affecting communication and social interaction will struggle when asking for help and support, because doing so, by definition, requires communication and social interaction. So, in struggling with this coworker and trying to explain to her the kind of environment that I needed, and I'm talking about someone who was very disruptive to my work. Periodically during the day, she would come around the corner and, "What you working on?" Those of you that have kids on the spectrum know that's not a good plan. I eventually devised a plan. I got these nice neon green headphones, and I said, if I'm wearing these, don't mess with me. That worked for a couple days. But I eventually started being asked to be separated from this coworker. And my requests for help met with so many interesting reactions. I ultimately asked to be moved from the e-learning team where I was to information technology, which would by default put me in another office. This started happening several months after I was diagnosed. At this point, I'm going to pause and I'm going to start with a series of 3 things that I want to focus on tonight, because these are the steps that I have worked out. I've had quite a few people ask me, well, they tell me that I seem to have an unusual number of close relationships for anyone, let alone someone on the spectrum. And people ask me how I pulled this off. So here are those 3 steps. The first one is to know yourself. And I think this is important for anybody. And seeing Dr. Whitney was my beginning for that step. And you have to start each step before you can begin the next ones, although you will learn all of them for the rest of your life. I'm still trying to figure out some aspects of myself, and I'm sure many of you are as well. But once Dr. Whitney told me that I have specifically Asperger's syndrome, there comes a decision point. Kristen drugged me, by the way, my wife has made it down. This is Chris in the back. Say hi. Should pray for her because she needs it. Because we're still married. So she drugged me in because she thought I was going to kill myself. I had gotten that low. Dr. Whitney told her that that was a very real concern and it was only going to get worse before it got better. But I was at a point to where either I was going to end my life or something was going to change. So if you're going to change anything, the first thing you have to do is ask, what's going on? You know, why do I feel so overwhelmed in certain circumstances that other people seem to be just fine in? Why do certain things bother me? What exactly is it that bothers me? And every now and then I still discover something new that bothers me. But in talking with Dr. Whitney and reading some of the things that he suggested, I began to learn what these things are. The other part to knowing yourself is being able to sort through your emotions. This is very difficult for people on the spectrum. There has been some long debate over whether we actually have emotions. I can end that for you right now. We feel very deeply, very intensely. It just doesn't always come out. And there's a reason for that. How many of you have ever told a small child to clean their room and they walk in and the place is just a disaster and they burst into tears? Yeah, every mom in here has, I guarantee it. I have told my own daughter that, and I thought of this the last time I was telling her to do this, because that's pretty much the same sort of thing. So you have this stuff coming in and you don't know what to do with it, and so you just pile it up on the floor. And eventually you try to clean it out so you can do some processing of something. And you don't even know where to begin to clean it up, so you just stuff it all in the closet. Eventually the closet will burst. They call it a meltdown. In fact, for future reference, the actual trigger for a meltdown usually isn't the event immediately preceding it. That closet gets bigger as you get older, so in trying to find the actual trigger, you should look back an amount of time depending on the age of the person that you're looking at. So maybe for a child, look at a day. For me, it's more like several weeks. But anyway, learning how all these things happen. And so I also started learning about how relationships work. Like the whole idea that social rules are fluid and communicated non-verbally, which is part of the problem with being autistic, is not seeing that nonverbal stuff. So I started approaching people, mostly bikers, because I'm the president of a motorcycle ministry. So I hang around bikers, and I would tell them, I have Asperger's syndrome, I have a hard time with relationships, and I was wondering if you would be my friend. Some people are chuckling, this works. Not as successful as I would have hoped, but I did meet some great people, and including a couple of really nice ladies. One of them I met through Kristen. Her name is Katie. Katie introduced me to her sister Deanna. Both of them bikers. They sort of kicked this thing off. So, and I'm sure several of you women are going to laugh at this, but if you get two women together and they say, we're going to have to catch up, they're going to sit down, they're going to have a little coffee, and they're going to pull out their emotional drawers, and they're going to start going through stuff. They're going to laugh, they're going to cry, they're going to hug each other, and they're both going to walk away feeling a lot better. Am I right? And that's what I thought. So they started trying to do this with me, and they would ask me, so what'd you go through this week? And so, of course, I would tell them the story, typical Aspie fashion. How many of your kids are good at telling stories in any kind of order? Yeah. So I would go through some of this stuff, and they would pick out certain things, and they would say, well, how do you feel about that? I don't know. And then they would start saying, well, I would feel frustrated, or I would be very happy. And this went on for a while, and finally I started figuring things out. So I built up kind of an emotional vocabulary with which I could actually explain this. Now, a really cool part of this is I started to see why women do this. Got my closet cleaned up, and I can kind of keep it that way. And this actually helped greatly with my marriage, because this is something Kristen was hoping she could do with me all along. Of course, when you're married to a guy, you kind of want to know how he's feeling, right? So this is all under knowing yourself. It's my step one, and it's an ongoing process throughout life. So back to work. The next step of my 3 is advocate for yourself. And I started trying to do this at work. So I would go and I would ask for certain things, and I was very open about my diagnosis at work. Initially, I was told that I was using it as an excuse, to which I responded, I have a paralyzed arm and a motorcycle in the parking lot that would disagree with that. Doesn't really fit, right? So then, when I was asking for help in establishing good communication with my coworkers, I was told that I should just wear a sign around my neck. At this point, I will point out that I have lots of disabled friends. I actually don't know anyone personally who's disabled who has not at some point been told that they couldn't ask for help or been given some advice along those lines. Later conversation with that same person, I was told that I couldn't request an accommodation because I don't look or act disabled. With the communication struggles that I was having, especially at the time, because I was going through a lot, I didn't have the skills to argue for my rights. And I shouldn't have to do it anyway. But this is the sort of thing that happens when an autistic adult asks for help. We don't look like we need help. I guess a really good illustration of another way that can work. I once boarded an airplane, and I asked the flight attendant for help in putting my bag into the overhead bin. And I'm about 3 times her size, so I can somewhat understand her perception. I mean, I could have lifted her, but I asked for her to help me put this thing up there, and she said, "Are you serious?" You know, some guy as big as me isn't going to ask for help if he doesn't need it, especially in lifting something. I finally got help from another passenger after they watched me struggle for a little bit. So this was what was going on for a long term. So learning to advocate for yourself is very difficult in that sort of environment. But at the same time, I was also developing friends. And I was starting to be able to talk to them and tell them, this is the sort of things that I need in relationships. the way a kid is going to learn to effectively advocate for himself is if he can express what he needs or wants and then get it. Because if he gets what he wants or needs, then he's going to know that he communicated effectively what it was that he wanted or needed. So I learned how to do this with my friends outside of work, and I tried to take those skills with me to work, but it didn't work. So this is part of the problem with step 2. Part of the success of the whole thing depends on the environment that you're in. I realize a lot of you already fight with the schools. I try to fight with them as much as I can as well. I a lot of times get the teachers before they get out of school. I'm really liking that part. And I know quite a few teachers, and it's interesting. They tell me after becoming my friend, they've had other teachers start seeing the changes in their classroom, and they'll ask, why don't you have trouble with this kid? and it's because they look at them differently. So in order to succeed with that part, you need the right environment. Otherwise, it's just going to shut the kid down. And I personally believe that one of the greatest gifts you can give your kid in the course of raising them is a good set of self-advocacy skills. So as things went further at work, and this was actually over the course of several years, I had a coworker finally stand up for me and say to several people, this is getting ridiculous and it needs to stop. I can't say my relationship with him was perfect. We had our disagreements, but I very much appreciate that. Another thing I would like to make parents aware of, I was talking to one the other day about a ministry she was working on for autistic children in her church. And I told her that this sort of ministry shouldn't just focus on children. I said, there are really only 2 ways you can prepare your kids for the struggle ahead. That is to talk to autistic adults who can actually tell you what it's like and tell you how they've learned to deal with it. And the other is to actually help autistic adults, because the more you help us reduce the struggle today, the less your kids have to face tomorrow. So if you somehow see this sort of thing at work, I would consider it a personal favor if you would be the one to stand up and say, this is stupid. The third step, once you have managed to be able to advocate for yourself, now at this point, think about, so you're on an airplane and they're explaining to you the whole oxygen mask, and they tell you put your own mask on before you help somebody else. I think you moms probably don't need a lesson on you need to take care of yourself before you take care of other people, because if you're not taking care of yourself well enough that you're functional, you're useless to anyone else. So this is why step 2 must come before step 3. You're just not going to be able to do it. Step 3 is to understand the needs and wants of others. This is a whole lot easier when I realize there are things that I need in a relationship, there are things that I really like to have in a relationship, and maybe that's true of other people. So a question that I get from counselors, and I got it a few weeks ago when I was talking to a group of counselors, how do I teach this kid to have empathy? Does anybody ask that question? Yeah, I like that. I told her she was asking the wrong question. The question you want to ask is, how can I help this kid express the empathy he already has? Has anybody ever heard of the empathy imbalance hypothesis? No one? Okay. I can actually put a link for it in the Autism Society page on Facebook later. It is an academic paper and it's quite long, so you're warned. I like to read this stuff Dr. Whitney said I'm also hyperlexic. Hyperlexic kids read dictionaries for fun. So there you go. The basic thing that this guy is trying to get across, though, psychologists recognize 3 different types of empathy. For the purpose of this discussion, we're interested in 2. There's cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is the ability to feel with others. This is the kind of thing that you actually think about when you think about empathy. And most people just assume that the cognitive empathy follows. So if you feel or understand what I'm feeling, you should express something. Those 2 are actually separated, and the latter is cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand intellectually the feelings and motivations of others and what lies behind it. I will point out that cognitive empathy alone is not necessarily a good thing. Paul Ekman, professor at University of California, San Francisco, he's a psychologist and he teaches specifically on emotions, says that a torturer needs this ability if only to better calibrate his torture. If he knows why you're hurt, he can make you hurt worse. Anyway, the empathy and balance hypothesis is saying that autistics have an overabundance of emotional empathy and a lack of cognitive empathy. So this is like a horse without any harness or any other means of control whatsoever. And it's a very powerful horse. So the problem here, so Tina is a very good friend of mine. I kind of fast forwarded through a whole lot of stuff, and I met her, was it the second Ride for Autism?
Last year.
Is it? Yeah, the third one. Okay.
It'll be our anniversary.
Yeah. So if I happen to encounter Tina, and Tina is a very expressive person, so it's very easy to figure out what she's feeling. So if I come up on Tina and let's say she's crying, I recognize that there's something not right. It will bother me a lot. I don't really know what to do with it. So I'm going to get overwhelmed and I'm going to shut down very quickly. I could possibly accept that I recognize that I do this. I think some kids, though, may have meltdowns as a result of this. My relationship with Tina, however, is good enough that I can ask Tina, what can I do? I understand I have this big pile of emotional empathy, so I'm very driven to do something. I just need Tina to help me understand what it is that she needs, and then we can move on from there. As I get to know her better, I will start to understand that, I'll start to recognize certain situations and then respond accordingly. I would like to think that I eventually get to the point where I do a pretty good job, but I've known Kristen now for 12 years, almost 13, still working on that. So, I've kind of bounced around a little bit. I want to get back to the anger thing. You've heard all these steps, how I've changed my life quite a bit. I've developed some very close relationships. I have some really good friends, a lot of them in this room. Matter of fact, I will pause here for a moment. I would like to introduce my current supervisor, who is a very good friend of mine. We've been friends for over a year now. This is Russell Minth. He's been my supervisor now for, 4 weeks? Yeah. And next, Russell is his supervisor, Sal, who has been in his position for a few months. Sal used to occupy the same office as Russell and I, and we're good friends too. So I guess to end the work story thing, it's a whole lot better than it used to be. I now have people, Russell has come to my house and we have talked things out that are happening at work, and then he started working on helping me with these things. So there's a big difference from what I experienced before. But the anger part, how many of you seen the movie The Avengers? It's less than I thought. Well, the rest of you will probably get what I'm about to say anyway. Does anybody not know who David Banner is?
Hulk.
He turns into the Hulk.
Yeah.
Guy gets angry, turns into the Hulk, right? I'm betting far fewer of you know who Natasha Romanoff is, so I will just say she is the one sent to go get the Hulk at the beginning of the movie. So she travels to this place where it's just war-torn and people are sick and they're dying all over the place, and he's trying to help them as best he can. And so she finds him in his house, and she says, you know, for a guy who's supposed to be avoiding stress, you picked a heck of a place to settle. And he said, avoiding stress is not the secret. And then they continue their conversation. He agrees to go help save the world and whatever. Fast forward for a little ways to almost to the end of the movie. The whole team is fighting this stuff. There's battle all over the place, and Iron Man is wrestling with this big worm-looking thing that's got armor all over it. And so here comes Dr. Banner rolling up on this piece of junk motorcycle, and he parks in the middle of the street. And he gets off, and he looks around, and he says, so this looks really horrible. And then Iron Man says he's going to turn this worm thing in their direction, so they better get ready for it. And Captain America says to Dr. Banner, he says, Dr. Banner, now might be a really good time for you to get angry. And he turns around and he starts casually walking toward this big thing that Iron Man is guiding his direction. He looks over his shoulder and he says, Captain, that's my secret. I'm always angry. And then he just smacks it. Now wait a minute. The guy who turns into a big green monster and tears everything up when he's angry is always angry. How is this a good thing? That's not really a complete answer to the question. So let's rewind back to where we found him. Why would a doctor be in the middle of that? Anybody know? Any guesses? What's that? I can't hear you. No. Why would any normal doctor be in that situation?
Help people.
Right. And why would he want to help people that couldn't pay him? Even if he couldn't save them all. Exactly. He has found something he loves. He hasn't stopped being angry at all. But because he's found something he loves and that he's passionate about, he's able to turn his anger in a useful direction. As I thought about this over the years since the question was first posed to me, I realized that the only reason I didn't decide to just kill myself and rather chose to make some changes to my life is because I got angry, and then I found something to be passionate about very shortly after. So what I would like to communicate to y'all as far as that question goes, help your kids find something they love. I mean, helping them find ways to manage their stress is important. I still have to work on that all the time. Helping them to manage their anxiety and their anger. I know some of them have pretty severe anger issues. I used to have to go out in the garage and yell and beat stuff. While you're working on that stuff, though, take a look at what lies ahead and find something that you can be passionate about. And for different kids, it's going to be different. I mean, some kid might get really passionate about computers. Some other kid might get really passionate about making statues with Legos. Whatever that is, help them find it, encourage them to go with it, be proud of them when they do it. And they'll probably develop more as they go on. Dr. Whitney told me that I was in the middle of a downward spiral. Autism leads to social dysfunction, which leads to social anxiety, which leads to depression, which leads to further social dysfunction. A lot of your kids are probably stuck in that, especially as they're teenagers. You can stop that cycle just by removing any part of it. Of course, you can't take the autism out. I found the easiest way is to remove the anxiety. But once you can actually do that, you can even turn it the other direction. Success leads to confidence, which leads to further success. So as your child successfully advocates for himself, he gains confidence, he will continue to do it. As he continues to succeed, he will gain more confidence. He will stop being quite so interested in getting his own needs met and start looking at meeting the needs of others. And eventually, I think many of them will start to develop interests in other people, in helping other people, in mentoring, which I know one young lady in the back is already doing. And it makes a difference in people's life, doesn't it? And it feels good. This is what I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about learning about relationships and about helping others like me avoid some of the challenges that I faced. So this is really what I had to talk about tonight, and I'm happy to have further conversations or answer questions if anyone would like. That's a multi-part question. I do have some sound issues, and some of them are kind of strange. I don't know how many of you know Michael Bertrand. He has Asperger's syndrome. I met him after a Zumba class. He says, "I heard you like to ride motorcycles. Aren't those loud?" I just laughed. My bike isn't as loud as the music they had in the Zumba class, but he was in the zone, and I could see him. I couldn't stand to be in the class. He was in the zone, though. I could see that as I was watching him, and I guarantee you that's what I look like on my motorcycle.
Michael's passionate about Zumba.
The sound of a motorcycle engine is music to me. So, and then as far as loud, buzzing lights drive me up the wall. You might not even hear them. So it's kind of a matter of what the sound is as to what defines noise. Some people may be bothered by the sound of some people laughing or crying. I'm not. So yes, feel free to cry around me. The noise won't bother me, but please help me understand how I can help you with it. I work in a field where people are generally antisocial, and I still have struggles. Social struggles will mess a career up right quick, especially if you run into any sort of problem and then you start needing help.
It helps to have a diagnosis.
Well, even having a diagnosis, it was difficult, but knowing yourself so that you can learn to communicate better,
Right.
that's going to be a key first step. And for me, what got me on that path was getting the diagnosis and knowing what it meant. I think it's that important. In that relationship, though, that person has made certain promises to you, so you have a right. No, I'm serious, and I will tell you that people on the spectrum take their promises very seriously. Broken promises are highly annoying. Whether we're the one breaking them, she's nodding, or it's someone else. I mean, seriously, when Dr. Whitney told Kristen that I might kill myself, his solution was to have me promise to call people before I did. And she's like, "That's it?" She's like, "Yeah, he's not going to kill himself with broken promise right before that. It's not going to happen." Drugs. Seriously, Dr. Whitney gave a list of suggested drugs to my doctor. She went through the stuff that I'm already on. She picked the one she thought would work the best, and I started taking it. I stopped taking it for a while because I thought I was doing pretty well without it. But even though I was doing really well, I was also pushing myself harder, so I went back on it. Like stuff like tonight, I wouldn't be able to do without it, and I think this is important. So I think taking the drugs. I have refused to take many drugs in the past because I don't like anything that changes the way my brain feels. You could, however, once she gets to be an adult, she might stop doing it entirely, and I would hope the goal is to eventually getting her to function on her own. So the challenge then is to be able to have this conversation. I think at some point the person who is on the spectrum should be able to make an informed decision as to whether they're going to take a drug. I will tell you that my own experiences with drug was not nearly as good as the answer I gave her. If I could actually do all of the things that I really want to do without having to fight through the anxiety, without the drugs, I would stop taking them too. I think if a person can manage their anxiety without drugs, then it's reasonable to not take the drugs. But I'm not sure it's a conversation you should necessarily let go of because in the adult world, certainly in a career,
She'll always be able to control her environment.
right? Unless she gets lucky like me. I think that excessive emotional empathy is going to get us one way or another. If you watch the behavior of large numbers of people on the spectrum, you will notice that they will go to one extreme or another and never quite hit that happy medium where you're getting it right. I think the difference between us may simply be that I buried all my emotions in that closet and he didn't necessarily. But having that excess of emotional empathy, I think, gives us sort of a raw edge. In my case, people would tell me that I seemed like I had a chip on my shoulder and I was angry all the time. I suppose technically I was, but inside might actually be a whole lot different than what's going on the outside. Now, in the case of your son, it might be that you actually get to see what's going on the outside, but it comes out in a way that still doesn't quite work out. I know a lot of autistic adults around the world, so when I speak about the ones that I know, I may not have actually met them. Most of the ones that are nonverbal, I've met online, and I haven't met very many of them. I do find, though, that the ones that I have connected with online can communicate very well in text. But you have to consider that's a self-selected group that I'm already meeting on a text medium, so they probably wouldn't be there if they hadn't met with some success. Outside of that, the guys that did Wretches and Jabberers are extremely good communicators, though neither of them can speak, and I've actually met them. So my experience is limited and probably not a very good sample. Oh, it's huge.
In the sense of, as a parent, connecting your child with other autistic individuals.
I mean, just imagine meeting somebody somewhere and saying, you know, I've been struggling with this and it's been bugging me for a long time. And the other person says, I know, I struggle with the same thing. Isn't that great? And it has been really good to swap stories with a lot of the other autistic adults. Not all, but certainly the majority of them have stories that compare to mine in many ways. Some of them sound like they could have been my stories, which is both sad and at the same time comforting, because at least I'm not alone. Actually, among the biggest encouragements to me has been meeting a lot of you guys. Because you have all been so accepting and encouraging and just very easy to connect with. So finding people that understand, that aren't necessarily struggling with the same thing, but accept me anyway, that's a good thing.